The day I realized my parents kept breaking into my apartment wasn't the day everything fell apart. It was the day I understood how far they were willing to go to keep control. Lights I never turned on, food I never cooked. Blankets, shaped by bodies that weren't mine. People think family crosses lines out of love. But what if crossing lines is the only way they know how to own you? Because the moment I finally disappeared, that's when the real story began. Before we go further, I need you to decide. If your family invaded your home in the name of love, would you stay silent or walk away? Comment, stay, or leave right now. I wasn't always this cautious. There was a time I believed boundaries were simple. You draw a line, people respect it. That belief only works if the people around you see boundaries as real. In my family, a line was never protection. It was an invitation. Even at 29, my body reacted before my mind did. My phone lighting up with my mother's name still made my shoulders tighten. My father's voice slipping into that soft, careful tone he used whenever he wanted something quietly surrendered still made my stomach drop. I told myself it was conditioning, old habits, childhood echoes. But echoes don't break into your apartment. Growing up, privacy was a myth. Other kids talked about it like something ordinary, like running water or locked doors. In our house, my bedroom door might as well have been made of glass. My mother, Evelyn, walked in whenever she pleased, sometimes humming, sometimes silent, always searching. She read my notebooks under the guise of concern. She skimmed my journals, pausing just long enough to ask questions that felt like traps. "You hide too much," she'd say, as if secrecy were a moral failing and not a response. She never asked why I hid. She never had to. Control doesn't ask questions. It answers them for you. My father, Thomas, never stopped her. He specialized in neutrality that always favored power. He'd shrug, mumble something about keeping the peace, and let her continue. Silence, in our house, was agreement. Meanwhile, my younger sister Leanna lived under an entirely different sky. Her room was off limits. Her mess was called creativity. Her mistakes were phases she would grow out of. Mine were warnings, signs, evidence that something was wrong with me. We lived in the same house with two sets of rules, and I learned very early which ones applied to me. So, when I finally moved out into a one-bedroom apartment overlooking the Denver skyline, I believed I'd crossed some invisible threshold into adulthood. I bought my own dishes. I arranged my bookshelf by mood, not category. I hung soft string lights that made the evenings feel gentler than anything I'd known growing up. I breathed differently there. Slower, deeper, as if my lungs finally trusted the air around them. That peace lasted exactly long enough for my mother to decide it didn't belong to me. The first time she let herself in, she acted like it was a surprise visit. She carried groceries I hadn't asked for, bags already organized by category. She pulled an apron out of her purse, and started cooking like she'd been waiting all week for the chance. My father settled onto my couch, commenting on the view, though his eyes kept drifting to the mail on my counter. I told myself it was a misunderstanding, an overstep she'd correct once I explained. But explaining to my mother had never changed anything before. It didn't now. Then came the smaller things. Containers moved. Clothes I hadn't worn in months, suddenly sitting in my laundry basket. A faint imprint on my pillow. Liana borrowing my sweater without asking. My laptop left open to tabs I didn't recognize. Each incident was small enough to dismiss. That's how it works. No single moment feels serious enough to confront. But together, they form a pattern. And I knew that pattern better than anyone. My mother called it love. My father called it protection. And I was supposed to call it normal. Except this time, it wasn't their house. It was mine. The shift didn't happen all at once. It was slow, quiet, like a draft slipping through a window you thought was sealed. Cabinets left open, spices rearranged, towels folded the wrong way. Harmless things, easy to excuse. But that's how my mother operated. Not with storms, but with breezes that eventually turned into winds, strong enough to push you back where she wanted you. One Thursday evening, I came home and opened my refrigerator. The cold air spilled out, carrying the unmistakable order of her preferences. Produce on top, proteins in the middle, temptation foods hidden behind everything else. The frozen meals I bought for long work weeks were gone. In their place sat jars of her soups, her dressings, her idea of what my life should look like. I stood there with the fridge door open, realizing I wasn't imagining it. I was being managed. Liana treated my apartment like a bonus level in a game she already owned. Mascara smudges near my mirror. Half-finished iced coffee cups in my sink. Clothes draped over my chair like she planned to return any minute. When I confronted her, she laughed. "Relax, Riley. You act like I'm a stranger." She always said it like I was unreasonable. Like the problem wasn't her crossing lines, but me wanting them respected. The denial snapped 2 weeks later. I came home after a long day, craving silence, and found my laptop open on the coffee table. Pages of notes I hadn't written, searches I didn't make. One of my project drafts half-clicked, as if someone had started reading and lost interest. My chest tightened. I called my mother. She picked up immediately. "Oh, sweetheart, don't be dramatic," she said when I asked if she'd been there. "Your landlord let me in. I told him you weren't answering, and I was worried." Something inside me went cold. "You lied to get into my home," I whispered. "That's not lying," she replied smoothly. "That's concern. You isolate. You need support." Support. That word closed around my throat like a trap. After we hung up, I slid down against the couch and let the weight of memory crash in. Open journals, monitored texts, location tracking disguised as care. This wasn't new. This was the same pattern, revived. The next morning, I booked an emergency therapy session. My therapist listened, then leaned forward. "Riley, this isn't concern. It's enmeshment. These are boundary violations." She paused. "Your home isn't safe," she said gently. "Not emotionally. Not psychologically." The truth didn't knock. It barged straight through my chest. If I stayed, they would never stop. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and typed 4 words into the search bar: Secure Apartment Buildings, Denver. For the first time in my life, privacy didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt like a choice. If you want part 2, where I secretly plan my exit and realize disappearing might be the only way to survive, type next, and don't skip the question, stay or leave. Decision didn't feel brave. It felt necessary. That distinction matters, because bravery implies choice. What I felt that night at my kitchen table wasn't courage. It was clarity, the kind that shows up after denial burns out and fear finally runs out of places to hide. Secure Apartment Buildings, Denver. I stared at the search results longer than I expected to. Buildings with keycard access, staffed lobbies, cameras in elevators and hallways. Places designed not for charm, not for persuasion, but for rules. Hard ones. For most of my life, rules had been weapons used against me. Now, I needed them to be shields. Scrolling through listings, I realized something that stopped me cold. My world had been small, not because I lacked ambition, but because I'd been trained to believe privacy was a privilege reserved for other people, people who weren't difficult, people who didn't need so much space. That night, for the first time, privacy felt like something I was allowed to want. I scheduled a tour for the next morning, choosing a building downtown without telling anyone. Not even Liana. Especially not Liana. The secrecy felt wrong at first. Sneaky, like I was doing something I wasn't supposed to do. That reaction alone told me how necessary it was. The lobby smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and polished stone. Soft lighting. No clutter. No personal touches. The kind of place where nothing lingered unless it belonged. The leasing agent smiled professionally and asked for my ID. No small talk. No probing questions. Just procedure. I followed her into the elevator, tapped a temporary access card, and watched the doors slide closed. The sound was solid. Final. She showed me a corner unit with tall windows and a locked balcony. The city stretched out below, distant enough to feel quiet. The door closed behind us with a click that sounded like a promise. I stood there longer than necessary, imagining mornings where nothing had been rearranged while I slept. Evenings where silence wasn't waiting to ambush me. "I'll take it," I said before fear could argue. I signed the lease with hands that trembled just slightly, not because I was unsure, but because this was the first decision I'd made, without anticipating my mother's reaction first. The move had to happen in secret, not for drama, for survival. I told 2 people, Mara and Jonah, friends who'd seen enough of my family dynamics to understand without explanation. They didn't ask questions. They showed up. After midnight, hoodies pulled low, voices quiet like we were planning a heist, boxes taped softly, drawers emptied methodically. "Tell me again why we're whispering," Jonah murmured. "Because if they show up," I whispered back, "I won't be able to leave." That was the truth. If my mother walked through that door, she would talk, cry, reason, frame it as concern until my resolve cracked just enough for her to step inside and stay. We packed everything that felt like mine. Clothes, books, kitchenware I'd bought with my own money. I left behind anything that felt too entangled. Mugs my mom insisted were good for me, sweaters Liana claimed whenever she felt like it, framed photos my father hung to make the place feel like home. I wanted no excuses, no anchors. At 2 a.m, the moving truck idled outside, engine barely humming. Each trip down the hallway felt like a countdown. When the last box was loaded, I stood in my empty apartment and took one last look. It didn't feel sad. It felt unfinished in a way that meant progress. I locked the door, slid the emergency key my mother once waved like a badge of honor into an envelope, and addressed it to the landlord. No note, no forwarding address. At the new building, the night staff checked my ID, handed me a sleek black keycard, and said, "Welcome home, Riley." They didn't know what that meant to me. The door closed behind me with a sound I'd never heard before. Final. I slept for 12 straight hours. No jolting awake. No listening for footsteps. No scanning for changes. When I woke, the light spilling across the floor was exactly where I'd left it. Nothing had moved. For 3 days, I kept my phone on silent, face down. I let the world shrink to the quiet hum of the building, the soft echo of my own footsteps. The unfamiliar comfort of knowing every sound inside these walls came from me. Peace felt strange at first, like wearing a coat that didn't quite fit yet. On the morning of day 4, I flipped my phone over. The screen lit up like a warning flare, missed calls stacked on top of each other, texts flooding in, voicemails from numbers I recognized, and a few I didn't. "Riley, answer immediately. This isn't funny. Where are you? We're coming." Then Liana's social media post. "My sister is missing. Please pray she comes home." Missing. The irony almost made me laugh. But the longer I scrolled, the more I realized this wasn't panic. It was escalation. I set the phone down, heart racing, when it rang again. "Unknown number," I answered. "Is this Riley Morgan?" a calm voice asked. "Yes, this is Officer Ramirez with the Denver Police Department. Are you safe at the moment?" My stomach dropped, but my voice stayed steady. "I am. I'm calling because members of your family were involved in an incident at your former residence. We need you to come to the station to verify a few details." I closed my eyes. They tried to break in, didn't they? There was a pause. They attempted to enter a unit they no longer had access to. The current tenants believed it was a burglary. Of course they did. "I'll come in," I said. At the station, Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The smell of stale coffee hung in the air. A receptionist directed me to a small conference room. When I stepped inside, the scene hit me like a slap. My mother sat at the table, mascara smeared, tissues clenched in her hands. My father stood beside her, jaw tight, eyes darting toward the door. Liana paced in the corner, arms folded, blotchy and furious. The moment my mother saw me, she gasped and stood so abruptly her chair scraped the floor. "Oh my God!" she cried. "Where have you been? We thought you were dead." Dead. The word hung there, heavy with irony. "I'm fine," I said quietly. "You shouldn't have been at my apartment." "That's not your apartment anymore," my father muttered. Officer Ramirez entered then, calm and controlled. "Let's all sit." My mother collapsed back into her chair dramatically. I remained standing until the officer gestured for me to sit across from them. "Miss Morgan," she said, "your family reported you missing." "I wasn't missing," I replied. "I moved." "You moved?" my mother repeated, as if I'd confessed to a crime. "Without telling us?" "Yes," Liana scoffed. "You're being ridiculous. If you'd just told us, none of this would have happened." Officer Ramirez cleared her throat. "Let's focus on what did happen." She described the attempted entry, the balcony, the witnesses. My mother protested. My father deflected. Liana minimized. Then the officer said calmly, "Miss Morgan, would you like to formally document these boundary concerns?" The room went still. "Document?" my mother whispered, horrified. "She's an adult," Officer Ramirez replied. "And these actions constitute trespassing." I inhaled slowly. "I moved because you wouldn't stop entering my home," I said. My mother's eyes flashed. "We only wanted to help." "You lied to my landlord," I said evenly. "You told him I was unstable." Silence. The officer slid a form across the table. "I recommend a written boundary agreement." I leaned forward. "My terms are simple," I said. "You don't come to my home. We meet only in public places. You don't access my belongings, accounts, or mail." "That's extreme," my father muttered. "No," I said softly. "That's adulthood." They signed, reluctantly, slowly, but they signed. As I walked out of the station into the cold Denver air, something inside me finally loosened. I hadn't vanished. I'd arrived. If you want part 3, where the fallout spreads, the family narrative collapses, and I realize distance doesn't end control attempts, it exposes them. Type next. Distance didn't end my family's control attempts, it exposed them. For years, their power came from proximity. Access. The ability to walk into a room and rearrange it until it fit their comfort. The moment that access was gone, something ugly surfaced. Panic, rage, narrative scrambling. Control without entry has to get louder to survive. The boundary agreement worked on paper. In reality, it triggered something else. The first week after the police station, my mother followed every rule with exaggerated obedience. She texted before calling. She asked instead of assuming. She apologized in that careful, scripted way that sounds sincere until you notice it never names the actual harm. "I'm sorry you felt overwhelmed. I'm sorry you misunderstood my intentions. I'm sorry you took it that way." Not once did she say, "I broke into your home." My father became quieter, watchful. The kind of silence that doesn't mean peace, only recalculation. Liana oscillated between resentment and forced cheer, like she was waiting for things to snap back to normal if she acted long enough. They hadn't accepted the boundary. They were studying it. I noticed the shift when mutual acquaintances started reaching out. "Your mom's really worried about you. She says you've been isolating. Have you been okay lately?" The message was always the same, just dressed in different voices. Concern. Outsourced. I realized then that when my family couldn't reach me directly, they reached around me. This was never about losing me. It was about losing control of the story. My mother needed me unstable, difficult, fragile. Because if I was simply an adult choosing distance, her behavior had no justification, so she rewrote me. The second incident came quietly. I was at work when a security alert pinged my phone. Someone had attempted to access my old building using my name. Not my unit. My name. I called the property manager immediately. Yes, he said, hesitant. She said you were having an episode. My grip tightened around the phone. She told us you weren't responding to calls and she was afraid for your safety. I closed my eyes. She asked if we could release your forwarding address. My stomach dropped. Did you? No, he said quickly. We refused. That's why I'm calling. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat very still. This wasn't panic anymore. This was escalation. My mother had crossed from invasive to dangerous. Not physically, but reputationally. Once someone starts painting you as unstable to regain access, you are no longer dealing with concern. You are dealing with coercion. That night, I documented everything. Dates, times, names, messages, screenshots, voicemails. I saved them the same way I saved work files. Calm, organized, emotion removed. Trauma teaches you how to survive. Experience teaches you how to protect yourself. 2 days later, Leanna showed up at the cafe we'd agreed to meet at. She arrived early and chose a table near the window. Strategic, visible, public. She smiled too wide when she saw me. Look at you, she said, all mysterious. I didn't sit down right away. Why are you telling people I'm unstable? I asked. Her smile flickered. What? Mom told the old building I was having an episode. Leanna sighed dramatically. She's just scared. No, I said. She's trying to get my address. Leanna leaned forward. You're being paranoid. There it was. The word that had followed me my entire life. I'm being observant, I replied. There's a difference. Her jaw tightened. You're tearing the family apart over nothing. I finally sat down. I didn't tear anything apart, I said evenly. I stepped out of the role you assigned me. She scoffed. You always make everything about you, and you always minimize, I said. That's why this works for you. She stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. Do you know what happens when people lose access? I continued. They show you who they really are. Liana stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly enough for nearby patrons to glance over. Fine. Be alone then. She walked out. For the first time, I didn't chase her. The fallout intensified after that. My mother began posting vague messages online. Quotes about family, about betrayal, about daughters who forget where they come from. The comments filled with sympathy, with validation. She wasn't asking for me back. She was collecting allies. That's when I understood something crucial. My family didn't fear losing me. They feared losing authority over how I was perceived. So I stopped engaging emotionally and started responding strategically. I sent one message. 1. Any further attempts to access my residence, reputation, or records will be documented and addressed legally. This includes third parties. No explanation, no debate, no apology. The silence that followed was not peace. It was restraint. Weeks passed, then months. The pressure eased. Not because they understood, but because the cost had become visible. Security calls, police documentation, witnesses, paper trails. Control thrives in the dark. Boundaries shine a light. The strange thing was how quickly my body noticed the change. I slept deeper. I stopped flinching at my phone. I laughed more easily. The constant vigilance that had hummed under my skin for decades began to fade. I wasn't cured. I was safer. One evening, standing in my kitchen, I realized something that stopped me mid-thought. No one had rearranged anything in months. The spices were where I left them. The blankets were untouched. The silence was neutral, not threatening. I hadn't disappeared. I had been reclaimed. And that was when the final truth landed. Heavy and clear. Boundaries don't end relationships. They reveal which ones were never built on respect to begin with. If you want part 4, where my mother makes her boldest move yet, and I'm forced to choose between legal escalation and permanent distance, type next. The boldest moves never look bold at first. They look reasonable, concerned, even kind. That's how my mother made her next play. It started with an email, not to me, to my workplace. The subject line was innocuous enough. Concern regarding employee well-being. I didn't know about it until HR called me into a meeting late one afternoon. The office was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every footstep sound like a judgment. My manager sat across from me, hands folded, expression careful. "We received a message from a family member," she said gently. "Your mother." The word landed heavier than it should have. "She expressed concern about your mental health." My manager continued. "She said you've been under a lot of stress, that you've been isolating, and that she's worried about your safety." I felt my pulse slow, not spike. That was new. Panic had been replaced by something colder. "She suggested," my manager added, "that we check in." Check in. Another soft phrase hiding a sharp edge. I nodded. "Did she provide any evidence?" My manager hesitated. "No, just her perspective." There it was again. Concern without proof. Narrative without accountability. "I appreciate you telling me," I said calmly. "But this is not the first time she's done something like this." I explained everything. The apartment, the police, the boundary agreement, the attempted entry, the calls to my old building, the pattern. My manager listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back and exhaled. "I'm sorry," she said. "This shouldn't be happening to you." For the first time, someone in authority believed me without needing convincing. HR documented the interaction. They assured me my job was not at risk. But as I walked back to my desk, one truth burned through every layer of calm I'd built. My mother had crossed into my livelihood. This wasn't about love. This wasn't about fear. This was about control at any cost. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't spiral. I opened my laptop and added a new folder to the one I'd been building for months. Escalation. I saved the email, the timestamps, the HR notes. I wrote a short summary while the details were fresh. Not emotional, just factual. People like my mother count on exhaustion, on the hope that you'll decide it's easier to give in than to keep documenting. She underestimated me. 2 days later, I received a message from an attorney, a friend of a friend. I'd consulted quietly after the police incident. I forwarded him the new information. His reply was brief. "This is harassment, and it's now affecting your employment. That matters." We scheduled a call. He didn't sugarcoat anything. "Your mother is attempting to establish a narrative of instability," he said. "That's not accidental. That's groundwork." "For what?" I asked. "Guardianship, conservatorship, control of decisions, access." The words sat heavy in my chest. "She's laying a paper trail," he continued. "If you don't respond formally, she controls the story." I stared out the window at the city lights. "So what do I do?" "You escalate," he said, "or you disappear completely. Those are the options." Disappear. The word echoed, familiar and strange all at once. I thought I'd already done that. But distance, I was learning, wasn't invisibility. Not to someone determined to pull you back. "What does escalation look like?" I asked. "Cease and desist," he said. "Formal notice. Legal boundaries. Consequences." The next week was a blur of preparation. The letter was clear, unemotional, specific. It outlined every documented incident. The trespassing attempt, the false statements to my landlord, the false statements to my employer, the social media posts implying disappearance, the pattern of interference. It demanded immediate cessation of contact beyond agreed public meetings. It prohibited third-party communication about my health, location, or stability. It warned that further violations would result in restraining orders and civil action. I read it 3 times before signing. My hand didn't shake. When the letter was sent, the silence that followed was unlike anything before. No apologies. No rage texts. No vague quotes online. Nothing. For 3 days, I wondered if this had finally ended it. Then Liana called. I almost didn't answer. Almost. Curiosity won. Are you happy now? She demanded the moment I picked up. I'm safe, I replied. That's not the same thing. You've gone too far, she said. A lawyer? Really? I didn't start this, I said. I responded to it. You're destroying Mom, Liana snapped. I closed my eyes. No, I stopped letting her destroy me. Silence on the line. She cries all the time, Liana said finally, her voice cracking. She doesn't sleep. I felt the old reflex tug at me. The urge to fix, to soften, to take responsibility for emotions that were never mine to carry. Then I remembered the email, the HR meeting, the word episode. She's an adult, I said quietly. So am I. You've changed, Liana whispered. Yes, I said. That's the point. I hung up before she could respond. That night, I slept soundly, not because everything was resolved, because I'd stopped negotiating my right to exist without surveillance. The days that followed were steady, uneventful, boring even, and I learned something important. Peace doesn't announce itself, it just stays. My mother didn't contact my workplace again. She didn't approach my building. She didn't try to triangulate through friends. The cost had finally outweighed the reward. Control failed when it met consequence. Weeks later, sitting alone in my apartment, I realized I hadn't checked my phone in hours. I hadn't needed to. The background noise of fear had quieted enough that I could hear myself think. I wasn't numb. I was free. But freedom has a final test, and mine was coming. If you want part 5, where my family tries one last emotional ambush, and I'm forced to decide whether distance is enough, or if no contact is the only answer, type next. Control doesn't disappear when it fails. It changes tactics. The final ambush didn't come as a threat, a lie, or a legal maneuver. It came as an invitation. A handwritten card arrived at my apartment. Thick cream paper, familiar looping script, my mother's handwriting. Unmistakable. Family dinner. Just us. No lawyers. No police. I stood in my kitchen holding the card between 2 fingers like it might contaminate me. This was new. No guilt-laced essays. No accusations. No emergencies. Just a plea wrapped in civility. That's how I knew it was dangerous. People who respect boundaries ask before crossing them. People who don't ask permission dress violations up as reconciliation. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I sat down and did something I'd never done before. I imagined the evening. I imagined the table, the careful smiles, the way my mother would reach for my hand and hold it just a second too long, the way my father would clear his throat and say something like, "We all made mistakes." I imagined Liana watching my face, waiting for me to soften, waiting for the moment I'd slip back into my role, the reasonable one, the forgiving one, the one who absorbs impact so others don't have to. I realized something that stopped me cold. If I went, it wouldn't be to heal. It would be to perform, and I was done performing. I called my therapist. She didn't hesitate. "Riley," she said, "this isn't a conversation. It's a test." "A test of what?" I asked. "Of access," she replied. "They want to see if the old buttons still work." That night, I drafted a response. Short, clear. "I'm not comfortable meeting privately. If there's something you need to communicate, you can put it in writing." I stared at the message for a long time before sending it. Then I pressed send. The response was immediate. My phone lit up with call after call, voicemails stacked like falling dominoes. I didn't listen. I already knew the script. The next morning, Liana showed up at my building. She didn't get past the lobby. Security called my unit to ask if I was expecting a guest. "No," I said. They handled it. That was the moment it finally clicked. I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to justify. I didn't need to convince. I just needed to stop opening doors. That afternoon, I sat at my desk and made a list. Not of grievances, not of memories, of facts. My parents had entered my home without consent. They had lied to gain access. They had involved police under false pretenses. They had contacted my employer. They had attempted forced entry after I moved. They had ignored written boundaries. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was a pattern. And patterns don't respond to patience. They respond to limits. I scheduled another meeting with my attorney. He listened quietly, then nodded. "You're at a fork," he said. "Limited contact with enforcement, or full no contact with protection." "What's the difference?" I asked. "Limited contact assumes good faith," he said. "No contact accepts reality." Reality. That word landed differently now. Reality wasn't cruel. Reality was clarifying. "I want no contact," I said. The process wasn't dramatic. There were forms, affidavits, a formal notice. A restraining order wasn't necessary yet. But a legal boundary was established. Any further attempts to contact me directly or indirectly would trigger escalation. When the paperwork was finalized, I felt something unexpected. Grief. Not for the relationship I lost, for the one I never had. I mourned the version of parents who respected space. The version of a sister who didn't minimize harm. The fantasy that love automatically meant safety. Grief doesn't mean doubt. It means acceptance. The weeks after no contact were quiet. Not empty. Quiet. I learned what my mind sounded like when it wasn't bracing. I stopped checking locks twice. Stopped scanning rooms for traces. Stopped editing myself before speaking. One evening, I invited Mara and Jonah over. We sat on the balcony watching the city settle into night. "You're different," Mara said. "Lighter." I smiled. "I stopped carrying people who didn't want to walk beside me." She nodded. "That'll do it." Months passed. No emails, no calls, no accidental run-ins, and something else changed. My work improved. My sleep deepened. My laughter came faster. I wasn't just safer. I was more myself. One night, scrolling aimlessly, I found Liana's profile. She'd posted a photo with our parents, smiling. Captioned, "Healing takes time." I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. Healing doesn't happen where harm is denied. It happens where truth is allowed. I closed the app. I didn't need to correct the narrative. I was living my own. Here's the truth no one tells you. You don't owe access to people who confuse love with control. You don't owe proximity to people who ignore your no. And choosing distance doesn't make you cold. It makes you honest. If this story hit close to home, drop boundaries in the comments and answer this honestly for yourself. If protecting your peace costs you their approval, is that really a loss? Guilt is the last weapon control uses when everything else fails. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It waits until you're calm, until your life feels steady. And then it slips in quietly with questions that sound reasonable. Are you being too harsh? What if they change? What if one day you regret this? For the first few weeks of no contact, I felt almost euphoric. Like someone had finally turned off a noise I didn't realize had been playing my entire life. But once the quiet settled into routine, guilt began knocking. Not violently, politely. It showed up in small moments. When I passed a mother and daughter laughing together at the grocery store. When a coworker mentioned Sunday dinners with their parents. When I caught myself reaching for my phone out of habit, then remembering there was no one on the other end anymore. That's when I understood something important. Guilt wasn't proof I'd done something wrong. It was proof I'd been trained to put myself last. I talked about it in therapy. My therapist nodded like she'd heard this story 1,000 times. Guilt thrives in people who were rewarded for compliance, she said. Your nervous system learned that keeping others comfortable kept you safe. So how do I stop it? I asked. You don't fight it, she replied. You reframe it. She asked me to list the costs of staying. The list came easily. Constant anxiety, loss of privacy, emotional surveillance, fear of retaliation, self-doubt, hypervigilance, exhaustion. Then she asked me to list the costs of leaving: loneliness, grief, judgment, guilt. I stared at the two lists side by side. One threatened my survival, the other threatened my comfort. That was the moment my identity began to shift. I had spent my life being the reasonable one, the fixer, the one who absorbed tension so others didn't have to feel it. My value, in my family, came from how much discomfort I could carry without complaining. No contact forced me to ask a question I'd never allowed myself to ask before. Who am I if I'm not managing them? At first, the answer scared me. I didn't know how to exist without anticipating reactions. I didn't know how to make decisions without running them through an imaginary filter of approval and disapproval. I had been rehearsing conversations in my head for so long that silence felt suspicious. But slowly, something else emerged: curiosity. I noticed how I chose food when no one commented, how I decorated without worrying if it looked appropriate, how my opinions sharpened when they weren't constantly softened. I wasn't becoming someone new, I was uncovering someone old, the version of me that existed before every choice had consequences beyond reason. One afternoon, I realized I hadn't thought about my family in days. Not with anger, not with longing, just absence. And that absence didn't feel empty, it felt spacious. That's when the guilt made its final push. An email appeared in my inbox from an unfamiliar address. No name, just a subject line: I'm sorry. I didn't open it right away. My heart sped up, not with hope, but with recognition. Apologies from people who never take responsibility have a particular weight to them. They're designed to reopen doors, not to repair damage. I forwarded it to my attorney without reading it. He replied an hour later: it violates the no contact notice. I recommend we document and ignore. Ignore. Such a simple word, such a powerful act. I deleted the email without opening it, and something inside me unlocked. I didn't need closure from people who never offered safety. I didn't need validation from those who denied harm. Closure isn't something other people give you. It's something you choose. As months passed, my sense of self stabilized in ways I hadn't expected. I stopped explaining my boundaries to people who didn't need explanations. I became more decisive, more grounded. At work, I took on projects I would have previously declined. Afraid of visibility, I stopped shrinking in meetings. I spoke with clarity instead of apology. Outside of work, I built routines that felt intentional: morning walks, quiet evenings, friendships that didn't require vigilance. And something else happened. I started trusting myself. That trust had been eroded slowly over years. Every time my instincts were questioned, every time my feelings were minimized, every time concern was used as a weapon, no contact didn't just remove harmful people, it restored my internal compass. I learned that love doesn't require access, that family isn't defined by blood, but by behavior, that safety is not negotiable. And most importantly, I learned this: walking away wasn't abandonment, it was self-rescue. If you're watching this and feeling that familiar twist of guilt in your chest, hear this clearly. Guilt does not mean you're wrong. It means you're breaking a rule that was never meant to protect you. If someone benefits from your silence, your compliance, your discomfort, they will always call your boundaries selfish. That doesn't make it true. Drop free in the comments if you've ever felt guilty for choosing yourself. Peace feels wrong before it feels right. No one warns you about that part. After years of living in reaction mode, calm can feel like danger. Silence feels suspicious. Stability feels temporary. Your body keeps waiting for the moment it all collapses again. Because that's what it was trained to expect. For a long time, I mistook that feeling for intuition. It wasn't. It was conditioning. Rebuilding trust with yourself after control doesn't start with confidence. It starts with noticing small, almost boring moments where nothing goes wrong. Moments where you make a choice and no one challenges it. Moments where you exist without being observed. At first, Those moments felt hollow, like something was missing. What was missing was chaos. I didn't realize how much of my identity had been built around anticipation, predicting moods, managing reactions, adjusting myself in advance, so conflict never had a chance to start. When that stopped, my mind didn't suddenly relax. It went quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. That unfamiliarity scared me more than noise ever had. I remember standing in my kitchen one evening, staring at the clock, waiting for the guilt to hit, waiting for regret, waiting for the urge to reach out, to fix, to smooth things over. It didn't come. Instead, there was just space. That's when I understood something most people never articulate. When you leave a controlling environment, your nervous system doesn't celebrate. It grieves the structure it learned to survive in. Control gives rules. Even bad rules feel safer than none. So rebuilding trust with yourself means learning to live without a script. I started small. I made decisions without consulting anyone. Trivial ones. What to eat, when to sleep, whether to stay in or go out. I paid attention to how my body responded instead of how someone else might judge it. The first time I canceled plans simply because I was tired. My chest tightened. I waited for backlash that never came. The second time, it eased. By the 10th time, it felt normal. That's how trust rebuilds. Not in grand gestures, but in repeated proof that your needs don't require justification. There were setbacks. Certain smells triggered memories. Certain phrases from coworkers or friends would send me spiraling briefly. I learned to pause instead of reacting, to ask myself one question: is this happening now, or does it just feel familiar? That question changed everything. It separated the present from the past, reality from reflex. I stopped assuming danger where there was none. And when danger did appear, I didn't freeze. I responded. Another unexpected shift came in my relationships. I became more selective, not colder, clearer. I noticed who respected my time without explanation, who listened without minimizing, who didn't push for access disguised as closeness. Some friendships faded, others deepened. I realized I had spent years confusing intensity for intimacy, drama for connection, monitoring for care. Peaceful relationships felt almost dull at first, then they felt safe, then they felt right. One afternoon, I caught myself laughing alone. That moment stayed with me, because joy that isn't shared or approved or witnessed still counts. That was new for me. Rebuilding trust with yourself also means grieving who you were forced to be. I grieved the compliant version of myself, the apologetic one, the hyper-aware one. She wasn't weak. She was adaptive. She kept me alive in an environment that required constant vigilance. I honored her by letting her rest. I didn't need her anymore. As months passed, my sense of identity stopped feeling fragile. I no longer questioned every emotion. I stopped doubting my memory. When something felt off, I trusted the signals my body sent instead of overriding them to keep others comfortable. And then something subtle but powerful happened. I stopped needing closure. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need acknowledgement. I didn't need rewritten narratives. Understanding was enough. Understanding that control was never about me. Understanding that distance wasn't punishment. Understanding that peace didn't require permission. There is a myth that walking away hardens you. The truth is, it clarifies you. I became softer with myself, more patient, less reactive. I didn't feel the need to prove my experience to people who weren't willing to hear it. I let silence stay silent, and in that silence, I learned something final. Trusting yourself isn't about believing you'll never make mistakes. It's about believing you can handle the consequences without betraying yourself to avoid discomfort. That belief is freedom. If you've ever wondered why peace feels uncomfortable after chaos, now you know. It's not because something is wrong. It's because your system is recalibrating, and that recalibration is a sign of healing, not loss. If this part hit home, type trust in the comments. When survival stops being your primary skill, you have to learn how to live on purpose. That sounds obvious. It isn't. For most of my life, every decision had been shaped by one question: how do I avoid making this worse? Worse meant conflict. Worse meant guilt. Worse meant becoming the problem everyone whispered about but never named. Survival taught me how to minimize damage, not how to build joy. So when the danger was finally gone, I didn't feel free. I felt there was no crisis to manage, no emotional temperature to regulate, no invisible threat humming under the surface of every interaction. The absence of pressure felt like standing in a wide open field after living in a narrow hallway your entire life. I didn't know where to walk. At first, I filled the space with productivity. Extra work, extra goals, extra plans. It looked healthy from the outside, ambitious, focused, but it was still avoidance. I was staying busy so I wouldn't have to sit with the unfamiliar feeling of not being needed by anyone else. That realization came one quiet Sunday morning. I'd finished my to-do list by noon. The apartment was clean. The week was planned. There was nothing demanding my attention, and instead of relief, I felt restless. That's when it hit me. I didn't know how to exist without being useful. In my family, usefulness was safety. If you were needed, you were tolerated. If you were helpful, you were valued. Love was conditional on contribution, so when no one was taking from me, I felt unnecessary. That's the hidden cost of survival-based identities. They don't dissolve just because the threat is gone. They linger, waiting for purpose. I brought this up in therapy, and my therapist asked a question that rearranged something in my head. "What do you enjoy?" she asked. "When no one benefits from it but you." I didn't answer right away, not because I was hiding anything, because I genuinely didn't know. Enjoyment had always been secondary. Optional. A reward you earned after everything else was handled. I'd never built a relationship with pleasure that wasn't transactional, so I started experimenting, not with big things. Small, almost insignificant choices. I walked without a destination. I cooked meals that took time instead of efficiency. I listened to music without doing anything else. At first, it felt indulgent, almost wrong. Then it felt grounding. I noticed how my body responded when I wasn't rushing, how my thoughts softened when there was no audience, how my mood stabilized when I stopped scanning for the next problem. Living on purpose didn't mean chasing happiness. It meant removing the constant readiness for disaster. One of the hardest habits to break was waiting for consequences. I'd make a decision and then mentally brace myself. Waiting for criticism, waiting for punishment, waiting for someone to tell me I'd done it wrong. No one did. Weeks passed, then months. The other shoe never dropped. That's when I realized how deeply expectation shapes reality. I had been living as if stability were temporary, as if peace were borrowed time. But peace isn't fragile, it's only unfamiliar. I started investing in relationships that didn't feel urgent, friendships without emotional labor, conversations that didn't require strategy, people who didn't need me to perform or prove anything. Those relationships grew slowly, naturally, and they lasted. Another shift happened around identity. When people asked about my family, I stopped over-explaining. I stopped justifying. I stopped managing their reactions. "I'm not close with them," I'd say. And then I'd stop talking. Silence became a boundary I didn't have to defend. Some people leaned in. Others leaned away. That told me everything I needed to know. I also stopped romanticizing reconciliation. There's a cultural script that says growth means forgiveness, reunion, and closure. But not all stories end that way. Some end with distance and dignity. Letting go of the fantasy that one day they'd understand was painful, but it was also freeing. I didn't need them to change for me to move forward. I needed to stop waiting. The final piece of rebuilding life after survival was learning to trust calm. Calm isn't boring. It's informative. It tells you when something is aligned. It gives you room to notice what feels right, instead of what feels familiar. Familiarity isn't the same as safety. I used to confuse anxiety for intuition. I thought the knot in my stomach meant something was wrong. In reality, it meant I was used to tension. Now, when something feels calm, I don't question it, I let it be. And that's how I knew I'd crossed the last internal boundary. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was choosing. If you've lived most of your life in survival mode, here's the truth no one says out loud. You don't rebuild your life all at once. You rebuild it choice by choice, moment by moment, without waiting for permission. If this part resonates, type choosing in the comments. Control doesn't end with an apology. It ends when it stops working. I didn't know that at first. I thought no contact would fade quietly into the background of my life. Like an old habit finally broken. I didn't expect what happened next, because when people realize they can no longer reach you, they don't always let go. Some panic, some rage, and some collapse under the weight of a power they no longer have the energy to hold. The first sign wasn't direct. It never is. It came through silence that felt performative. Months passed with nothing. No messages, no third-party concerns, no accidental run-ins. The kind of quiet that feels intentional, like someone waiting to see if you'll blink first. I didn't. Then the narrative shifted. A distant cousin messaged me out of nowhere. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Hey, just wanted to check in. Your mom's been having a really hard time. There it was. Not accountability, not reflection, a report. I thanked her politely and didn't elaborate. That was the moment I understood the final phase of control. When access is gone, some people try to reclaim power through sympathy. If they can't reach you directly, they try to make the world lean on you, but something had changed. I didn't feel pulled, I felt detached. A week later, another message. A former neighbor, then an aunt. Different voices, same script. She's not herself. She misses you. She doesn't understand why you won't talk. Notice what was missing. No one asked why I left. No one asked what happened. No one asked what I needed. The story wasn't about reconciliation. It was about restoring order. And for the first time, I saw it clearly. My absence had created a vacuum. The family system that revolved around my compliance no longer had a stabilizer. When the compliant one leaves, dysfunction has nowhere to hide. I later learned what had been happening behind the scenes. My mother had turned inward. The energy she once spent monitoring me had nowhere to go. Without a target, her anxiety ate itself alive. She cycled through resentment, denial, and victimhood with no relief. My father withdrew even further. The role of passive enabler only works when there's someone else to absorb the consequences. Without me, he was forced to face the discomfort he'd always avoided. And Leanna? She became restless. The dynamic had shifted, and she didn't know where she fit anymore. I didn't hear any of this directly. I didn't ask. But patterns leave traces, and people talk when systems break. One afternoon, my therapist said something that reframed everything. When you leave a dysfunctional system, she said, it doesn't collapse immediately. It destabilizes. That destabilization isn't your responsibility. It's the system revealing itself without your participation. The guilt that once would have pulled me back didn't surface. Not because I was heartless, because I finally understood my role. I had been the buffer, the absorber, the translator, the one who made everything look functional from the outside. Without me, the truth was exposed. And here's the hardest truth of all. They didn't miss me. They missed the version of themselves that existed when I made things easier. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me free. The final attempt came quietly. A letter arrived at my attorney's office. Not to me. A request for mediation. On the surface, it looked reasonable. Neutral language. Professional tone. A desire to clear misunderstandings. But mediation assumes shared responsibility. There was none. My attorney forwarded it with a simple note. You are not obligated to respond. I didn't. And that was the moment power finally collapsed. Not with confrontation, Not with closure, with refusal. Weeks passed. Then, months. The messages stopped. The check-ins faded. The system adjusted to my absence. Life went on. Mine did too. One evening, standing on my balcony, I watched the city lights flicker on one by one. There was no sense of triumph, no dramatic relief, just steadiness. I realized then that power doesn't leave in a dramatic exit. It leaves when it no longer has an audience. Control needs engagement. Conflict needs reaction. Manipulation needs access. I had removed all three, and that's how it ends. Not with reconciliation, not with revenge, with quiet autonomy. If you've ever wondered what happens after you finally choose yourself, this is it. Life doesn't explode, it stabilizes, and the people who relied on your compliance learn to live without it, or they don't. Either way, you are no longer responsible. If this part resonated, type enough in the comments. Justice doesn't always arrive with an apology. Most of us grow up believing justice looks like understanding. Like someone finally saying the words we waited years to hear. I'm sorry. I was wrong. You didn't deserve that. But sometimes justice is quieter than that. Sometimes justice is a door that stays closed. For a long time, I thought closure would come from them. From acknowledgement. From remorse. From change. I thought that was the ending I needed in order to move forward. I was wrong. Justice came the day I stopped negotiating my reality. It came the day I realized I didn't need their agreement to validate my experience. I didn't need witnesses. I didn't need consensus. I needed alignment. Alignment between what I felt and how I lived. Between what I knew and what I allowed. That alignment was the real verdict. People ask me now if I regret it. If I ever think about reaching out. If I wonder what might have happened if I'd stayed and tried harder, the answer is no. Not because it didn't hurt, because it finally stopped hurting. Distance didn't erase the past, but it stripped it of its power. Memories stopped ambushing me. Triggers softened. The weight lifted in increments so small I almost didn't notice, until one day I realized my shoulders weren't clenched anymore. Justice didn't mean they suffered. It meant I stopped suffering. I built a life that didn't revolve around explaining myself. I stopped preemptively defending decisions no one was entitled to question. I trusted my instincts, without checking if they were reasonable enough to be accepted. I learned that peace doesn't require agreement. It requires boundaries. I still hear about them occasionally. Through distant channels, through social echoes that barely register anymore. Their lives continued. Mine expanded. That's justice. Not punishment, release. There's a misconception that walking away is an act of anger. That cutting contact is dramatic or cruel. In reality, it's often the most neutral decision you can make. It says, I see this clearly now, and I choose differently. Nothing more, nothing less. If you're watching this and waiting for permission to protect yourself, consider this your sign. You don't need them to understand. You don't need them to agree. You don't need them to change. You need to stop sacrificing your peace to maintain an illusion. Justice is living well without them. Justice is waking up without dread. Justice is choosing a life that doesn't require armor. And if your story looks anything like mine, here's the truth that took me years to accept. Walking away didn't make me ungrateful. It made me honest. It didn't break my family. It exposed it. And it didn't make me cold. It made me free. If this story resonated with you, don't stay silent. Silence protects patterns that should be named. Drop justice in the comments if you chose yourself. And if you know someone who's still living inside a home that doesn't feel safe, share this with them. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is show someone they're not imagining it. This isn't the end. It's the line where everything finally begins.